Margaret stood at the edge of the charity gala, nursing a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking. At 53, she had learned to navigate these events with practiced grace, her silver-streaked hair swept into an elegant chignon, her designer dress hiding the weariness she carried in her bones. She was there representing her nonprofit organization, hoping to secure funding for the literacy programs she'd spent the last decade building in underserved communities. The ballroom glittered with Manhattan's elite, their laughter echoing off crystal chandeliers, but Margaret felt like a ghost moving through their world. That's when she saw him. Alexander Winters cut through the crowd with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside. At 45, he was everything the magazines said: devastatingly handsome, impossibly wealthy, and notoriously private. His tech empire had revolutionized cloud computing, making him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. But it was his eyes that caught Margaret off guard, intelligent, searching, and in that moment, fixed directly on her. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said, approaching with 2 fresh glasses of champagne. His smile was warm, disarming. Margaret found herself smiling back despite her exhaustion. They talked for hours that night, standing in that same corner while the gala swirled around them. He asked about her work with genuine interest, his questions insightful and probing. She found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years, telling him about the children she'd taught, the barriers they faced, the small victories that kept her going. When the evening ended, Alexander asked for her number. Margaret hesitated, seeing the admiration in his eyes and feeling something she thought had died long ago stir in her chest. But reality crashed back quickly. She was a widowed grandmother with grown children and a modest salary. He was a billionaire who dated supermodels and actresses. The very idea was absurd. Still, she found herself typing her number into his phone, telling herself it was just networking, just a potential donor for her cause. Nothing more could come of this. Nothing should. The flowers arrived the next morning. Not roses, but wildflowers, the kind Margaret had mentioned loving during their conversation. The card was simple. "Dinner? I promise actual food this time, not just champagne and conversation." Though the conversation was exceptional, Margaret stared at the card for a long moment, her heart doing something foolish and dangerous. She called her daughter, Emma, who squealed with excitement. "Mom, he's Alexander Winters." "Do you know who he is?" Emma demanded. Margaret knew exactly who he was, which was precisely the problem. She texted back a polite decline, citing her busy schedule. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had meetings, program evaluations, and grant applications demanding her attention. But Alexander was nothing if not persistent. He showed up at her office the following week, having somehow discovered where she worked. He brought coffee, her exact order, which meant he'd been paying attention, and a proposal. His foundation wanted to fund her literacy programs, but he wanted her input on expanding the initiative nationwide. They spent 3 hours in her cramped office, surrounded by children's books and lesson plans, mapping out possibilities. Margaret tried to keep things professional, but Alexander made it increasingly difficult. He asked her to lunch to discuss funding details, then to dinner to meet potential donors, then to a museum opening because he remembered her mentioning her love of Impressionist art. Each time, Margaret felt herself weakening, felt the walls she'd carefully constructed beginning to crumble. He listened when she spoke, remembered details about her life, and looked at her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. After a month of his gentle pursuit, Margaret finally confronted him. They were walking through Central Park after another business meeting that had felt decidedly personal. "Alexander, what are you doing?" she asked, stopping beneath a canopy of autumn leaves. He turned to her, his expression serious. "I'm trying to convince you to give me a chance," he said simply. "To give us a chance." Margaret shook her head, fear and longing warring in her chest. "I'm too old for you. I'm too old for this. You should be with someone younger, someone who fits your world." Alexander stepped closer, his voice low and earnest. "I don't want someone younger. I want someone real, someone who challenges me, someone who makes me think about more than quarterly earnings. I want you, Margaret. Just you." Margaret didn't sleep that night. Alexander's words echoed in her mind, colliding with every insecurity she'd accumulated over the years. At 53, she'd made peace with her life, or so she thought. Her husband, David, had died 6 years ago after a sudden heart attack, leaving her devastated but eventually determined to channel her grief into purpose. She'd built a good life, surrounded herself with meaningful work and loving family. Romance was something she'd relegated to her past, a chapter closed when David took his last breath. But Alexander Winters had walked into her world and challenged everything she'd convinced herself was true. Could she really be attractive to a man 8 years younger, a man who could have anyone? Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw the lines around her eyes, the softness in her body that no amount of yoga could completely erase, the gray threading through her dark hair. She saw a middle-aged woman, not the object of a billionaire's desire. Surely this was some kind of mistake, some temporary fascination that would fade once he truly saw her. Her son, Michael, was less enthusiastic than his sister when she finally told her children about Alexander's interest. "Mom, be careful," he said over Sunday dinner at her apartment. "These wealthy guys, they collect things. People. What if you're just interesting to him, because you're different from his usual type?" His words cut deep, because they echoed her own fears. Emma, ever the romantic, argued back fiercely. Or maybe he genuinely cares. About her. Why is that so hard to believe? Mom is amazing. But Michael's skepticism planted seeds of doubt that grew wild and tangled. Margaret decided to create distance. She stopped responding to Alexander's texts immediately, declined his next dinner invitation, and threw herself into her work with renewed intensity. For a week, she convinced herself this was the right decision, the mature decision. But then Alexander showed up at her apartment on a rainy Saturday evening, soaked to the bone, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, standing in her doorway. "If I came on too strong, if I misread things, just tell me. But don't ghost me, Margaret. I thought we were at least friends." The hurt in his eyes broke something in her, and she invited him inside, knowing she was about to make either the best or worst decision of her life. They sat on opposite ends of Margaret's worn couch, a pot of tea between them, while rain hammered against the windows. Alexander had changed into a dry sweater she'd found in Michael's old room, and for once, he looked less like a billionaire and more like just a man, uncertain, hopeful, vulnerable. Margaret knew she owed him honesty, even if it meant revealing every insecurity that kept her awake at night. "I'm scared," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared that I'm too old for you, that this is some kind of fantasy that will shatter the moment reality sets in." Alexander listened without interruption as Margaret poured out her fears. She told him about the nights she couldn't sleep, worrying about what people would say, what his friends and business associates would think. She confessed that she felt invisible in a world that worshipped youth, that she'd made peace with being alone because it seemed safer than risking her heart again. She admitted that the idea of being intimate with someone new terrified her, that her body bore the marks of time and childbirth, that she wasn't the young woman she'd once been. When she finally fell silent, Alexander moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Do you want to know what I see when I look at you?" he asked. "I see someone who built something meaningful from grief. I see intelligence in your eyes and kindness in your smile. I see someone who challenges me to be better, to think beyond profit margins and stock prices. I see a woman who's lived enough to know what matters, and that makes you infinitely more attractive than someone who's only lived for Instagram likes." His words were simple but sincere, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. But Alexander wasn't finished. He shared his own vulnerabilities, how his wealth had made him a target, how women had wanted his money or his status, but rarely him. He told her about a broken engagement 5 years ago, when he discovered his fiancée had been leaking information to his competitors. He confessed that his parents' loveless marriage had made him cynical about relationships, that he'd bury himself in work because it was safer than risking his heart. "Then I met you," he said softly. "And for the first time in years, I felt something real. Age doesn't scare me, Margaret. Losing the chance to see where this could go, that scares me. In that moment, something shifted. Margaret made a choice to be brave, to trust, to open the door she'd locked so firmly. She leaned forward and kissed him, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. When they pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. "I'm still scared," she whispered. "Me too," he admitted. "But maybe we can be scared together." The next few months unfolded like a dream Margaret was afraid to wake from. Alexander was everything she'd hoped for, and nothing like what she'd expected. He didn't try to change her or mold her into some trophy girlfriend. Instead, he integrated himself into her life with surprising ease. He showed up at her literacy program events, sat cross-legged on classroom floors reading to children, and donated not just money but time. He asked thoughtful questions about her work and genuinely listened to her answers, implementing suggestions that improved his foundation's educational initiatives. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, like two people learning a new language together. Alexander respected Margaret's need for discretion, understanding that she wasn't ready for media attention or public scrutiny. They had quiet dinners at her apartment, long walks through the city, and conversations that stretched into the early morning hours. He met her grandchildren, Emma's twins, Sophie and Lucas, and won them over completely by getting down on the floor to build elaborate block towers and playing endless games of pretend. But it wasn't all easy. Margaret struggled with the disparities in their lives. When Alexander casually mentioned flying to Paris for the weekend, she had to remind him that she couldn't just abandon her responsibilities or afford such spontaneity. He owned 5 properties across the globe. She rented a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. He wore watches worth more than her annual salary. She clipped coupons and shopped sales. These differences created moments of tension, times when Margaret felt the chasm between their worlds was simply too wide to bridge. The turning point came when Alexander invited her to his estate in Connecticut for the weekend. Margaret had been putting off the visit, intimidated by the thought of his world, but she finally agreed. The property was stunning, but somehow not ostentatious, a restored farmhouse on 20 acres, filled with art and books and comfortable furniture. That evening, as they cooked dinner together in his state-of-the-art kitchen, Alexander shared something that changed Margaret's perspective. "I know my wealth makes you uncomfortable," he said, chopping vegetables with surprising skill. "But it's just a circumstance of my life, like the color of my eyes. It doesn't define who I am or what I value. What defines me is how I choose to live, who I choose to love. And Margaret, I'm choosing you." She realized then that she'd been holding his success against him, creating a barrier he'd been trying to overcome. That night, lying in his arms, she finally let herself believe that this could work, that their different worlds could merge into something beautiful and uniquely theirs. The inevitable happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret was leaving a teachers' conference when a photographer caught her and Alexander together, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing. By evening, photos were everywhere, splashed across gossip websites, dissected on social media, analyzed by entertainment reporters who had nothing better to do. The headlines were predictably cruel. Tech billionaire's surprising choice. Alexander Winter's older woman. Is this love or a midlife crisis? Margaret's phone exploded with calls from reporters, curious acquaintances, and concerned friends. She sat in her apartment that night, scrolling through comments that ranged from supportive to viciously ageist. Strangers analyzed her appearance, speculated about their relationship, questioned what a successful billionaire could possibly see in a grandmother type. Some comments defended her, praised Alexander's choice, and called out the double standard that made age gap relationships acceptable when the man was older but scandalous in reverse. But the negative voices were louder, more persistent, and they fed every insecurity Margaret had tried to overcome. Alexander arrived within an hour of the story breaking, having left a board meeting mid-presentation. He found her on her couch, phone in hand, face pale. "Don't read that garbage," he said, taking the phone gently from her grasp. "Those people don't know you, don't know us, and their opinions are worthless." But Margaret couldn't simply dismiss it. "They're saying I'm with you for your money," she said, her voice breaking. "That I'm taking advantage of you, that you'll realize your mistake and move on to someone appropriate. Someone younger. What Alexander did next surprised her. He called his publicist, drafted a statement, and posted it across all his social media platforms before Margaret could stop him. The post featured a photo of them from that night in Central Park, Margaret laughing at something he'd said, her face radiant in the golden autumn light. His caption was simple but powerful. "I've built companies, made investments, and calculated risks my entire career. But falling in love with Margaret Chin was the easiest, most natural decision I've ever made. She challenges me, inspires me, and makes me better every single day. To those questioning our relationship, save your energy. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Age is just a number. Connection, respect, and love are what matter. And Margaret, I love you." The post went viral within minutes. Margaret stared at it, tears streaming down her face, as Alexander pulled her close. "I love you too," she whispered, finally saying the words she'd been holding back. "I love you so much it terrifies me." He kissed her forehead gently. "Good. The best things in life should terrify us a little. It means they're worth fighting for." Alexander's declaration had consequences, both positive and challenging. While public opinion shifted somewhat in their favor, with many praising his honesty and their obvious connection, Margaret now had to navigate the reality of being in a relationship with one of the world's most prominent businessmen. The first major test came when Alexander invited her to his company's annual gala, a black-tie affair attended by tech industry leaders, celebrities, and politicians. Margaret spent weeks agonizing over what to wear, finally accepting Alexander's offer to have a stylist help her find the perfect dress. The night of the gala, Margaret felt like Cinderella, though she was old enough to be Cinderella's mother. She wore an elegant navy gown that made her feel beautiful without trying to be something she wasn't. Alexander couldn't take his eyes off her all evening, his hand never leaving the small of her back as he introduced her to his world. She met CEOs and venture capitalists, actors and politicians, and to her surprise, most were genuinely warm and welcoming. Alexander's business partner, James, was particularly kind. "He's been different since he met you," James told her during dinner. "Happier, more grounded. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." But not everyone was welcoming. Alexander's mother, Catherine Winters, attended the gala with her usual regal bearing and thinly veiled disapproval. She cornered Margaret near the dessert table, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You seem like a lovely woman," Catherine said, "but surely you understand this relationship is unconventional. Alexander has responsibilities, a legacy to consider. Children to provide heirs." The implication was clear. Margaret was too old to give Alexander children, and therefore unsuitable for the Winters dynasty. Margaret held her ground, years of teaching giving her the backbone she needed. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Winters," she replied calmly. "I understand that your son is a grown man capable of making his own decisions about who he loves and what makes him happy. I understand that I have grown children and grandchildren, that I've lived a full life, and that I'm not looking to be molded into anyone's ideal. And I understand that if Alexander wanted someone who fit your expectations, he would have chosen differently." Catherine's eyes flashed with something that might have been respect. "He's very taken with you," she admitted. "I suppose time will tell if this is sustainable." Margaret smiled. "I suppose it will. But I'm not going anywhere, Mrs. Winters. Not unless Alexander asks me to, and I don't think he will." Later, as they danced, Alexander apologized for his mother's behavior. Margaret shook her head. "She's protecting you. I respect that, even if I don't agree with her methods. We'll win her over eventually, or not. Either way, we're going to be fine." 6 months into their relationship, Margaret discovered a lump in her breast during a routine self-exam. She sat on the edge of her bathtub for 30 minutes, hand pressed against her chest, terror freezing her in place. This was different from age-related insecurities or public scrutiny. This was the fear that had haunted her since losing David. Cancer had taken her mother at 60, and Margaret had always wondered if she'd inherited that particular time bomb. She scheduled an appointment with her doctor without telling anyone, not even Alexander, convincing herself that there was no point worrying people until she had answers. The mammogram and biopsy were scheduled quickly. Margaret moved through those weeks in a fog of anxiety, maintaining her usual routines while her mind churned through worst-case scenarios. Alexander noticed something was wrong. He'd become attuned to her moods, could read the tension in her shoulders and the distraction in her eyes. "Talk to me," he pleaded one evening. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." But Margaret couldn't bring herself to share her fear, couldn't bear to see pity or panic in his eyes. "Just work stress," she lied, hating herself for it but unable to stop. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Margaret was alone in her apartment, grading papers, when her doctor delivered the news. The lump was cancerous, stage 2, requiring surgery and possibly chemotherapy. Margaret thanked the doctor calmly, scheduled the necessary appointments, and then collapsed on her floor, sobbing. This was it, proof that she was too old, too broken, too much of a burden. Alexander deserved someone healthy, someone whole, someone with decades ahead instead of this uncertain future. She made a decision in that moment. She would end their relationship before he felt obligated to stay, before her illness became his burden. When Alexander arrived that evening for their planned dinner, Margaret met him at the door with red-rimmed eyes and a speech prepared. "We need to talk," she began, but Alexander gently pushed past her into the apartment, his face etched with concern. "Whatever it is, just tell me the truth," he said. "Please, Margaret, no more walls between us." And so she told him everything: the lump, the diagnosis, her fear of treatment and possible death, her conviction that he should leave now while he could. She told him through tears that she wouldn't blame him, that he'd given her something beautiful and she'd always be grateful, but that she couldn't ask him to watch her fall apart. Alexander listened in silence, and when she finished, he pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," he whispered fiercely. "In sickness and in health, remember? We haven't said those vows yet, but the sentiment stands. I'm not going anywhere, Margaret. We fight this together, or not at all." The months that followed tested them in ways neither had anticipated. Margaret's surgery was successful, but the doctors recommended a course of chemotherapy as a precaution. Alexander rearranged his entire life without hesitation, delegating responsibilities, clearing his calendar, and becoming Margaret's primary support system. He drove her to appointments, sat through consultations, researched treatments with the same intensity he'd once applied to business ventures, and held her hair back when the nausea became overwhelming. The hardest part wasn't the physical toll but Margaret's struggle with vulnerability. She'd spent her adult life being strong, capable, self-sufficient. Now she needed help bathing when she was too weak, needed Alexander to cook and clean, needed him to see her at her absolute worst, bald, exhausted, sometimes too sick to even speak. She waited for him to retreat, for the reality of serious illness to dim the romance, but Alexander never wavered. He was there every morning with ginger tea and encouraging words, every evening with movies and comfortable silence, every moment she needed him. Emma and Michael rallied around their mother, creating a support network that included Alexander seamlessly. Michael, who'd been skeptical initially, pulled Alexander aside one day and said, "I was wrong about you. Thank you for loving my mother the way she deserves." Alexander's response was simple: "She makes it easy." Even Catherine Winters made an unexpected appearance, showing up at Margaret's apartment with homemade soup and a grudging admission. "My son loves you very much," she said stiffly, "and you've made him happier than I've ever seen him. That counts for something." 4 months after her diagnosis, Margaret sat in her oncologist's office and heard the words she'd been praying for: clear scans, no evidence of disease. She'd made it through to the other side. That evening, Alexander proposed, not with a grand gesture or public spectacle, but in her small apartment, both of them wearing sweatpants, her hair just beginning to grow back in soft patches. He got down on one knee, pulled out a simple platinum band with a single diamond, and said, "I know we've done everything backwards, falling in love before dating properly, facing the hardest times before the easy ones. But that's us, Margaret. We don't follow anyone's timeline but our own. I want to spend whatever time we have, whether it's 5 years or 50 by your side. Will you marry me? Margaret, crying and laughing simultaneously, pulled him up and kissed him hard.
Yes, she said.
Yes, 1,000 times yes. But on one condition, you have to promise that when things get hard again, because they will, you won't try to be strong all the time. Let me take care of you too. Alexander agreed, and they spent the rest of the night making plans for a small wedding with only their closest friends and family. It wouldn't be conventional, but then again, neither were they. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn day in the Connecticut farmhouse garden, exactly 1 year after their first meeting. Margaret wore a simple cream dress, her short hair elegantly styled, and she never felt more beautiful. Emma and Michael walked her down the aisle while Alexander waited at a simple arch decorated with wildflowers. Sophie and Lucas served as flower girl and ring bearer, taking their duties with adorable seriousness. Catherine Winters sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, while James served as Alexander's best man. The ceremony was brief, but meaningful. They'd written their own vows, and when Alexander spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. Margaret, you taught me that love isn't about perfect circumstances or ideal timelines. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be better, braver, more present. You've given me purpose beyond profit, shown me what truly matters, and loved me through doubts and difficulties. Age is irrelevant when souls connect the way ours have. I promise to cherish every day we have, to support your dreams, to hold your hand through whatever comes, and to never stop reminding you how extraordinary you are. Margaret's vows were equally heartfelt. Alexander, you came into my life when I convinced myself that my story was mostly written, that the best chapters were behind me. You proved me spectacularly wrong. You saw me when I felt invisible, valued me when I doubted my worth, and stood by me when I was at my weakest. You taught me that it's never too late for new beginnings, that love doesn't have an expiration date, and that vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness. I promise to build this life with you day by day, to challenge you and support you in equal measure, and to never let fear stop me from showing you how deeply I love you. The reception was intimate and joyful, filled with laughter and dancing and heartfelt toasts. Michael stood up and spoke about how Alexander had restored his faith in love, how watching them together had taught him that real partnership transcends superficial concerns. Emma shared stories of her mother's strength and Alexander's devotion, ending with, "They say love is blind, but I think real love sees everything, the flaws, the fears, the imperfections, and chooses to stay anyway." That's what these two have found. As the evening wound down, Margaret and Alexander found themselves alone on the terrace, looking up at the stars. "Do you have any regrets?" Alexander asked, pulling her close. Margaret considered the question seriously. She thought about the judgment they'd faced, the challenges they'd overcome, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "Not a single one," she finally said. "Well, maybe I regret not wearing more comfortable shoes." They both laughed, and Alexander kissed her forehead. "I love you, Mrs. Winters," he said softly. "I love you too," Margaret replied. "And I promise I'm not too old to keep up with you for a very long time." Years would pass, bringing new adventures and inevitable challenges. They would travel the world, expand the literacy foundation, eventually welcome more grandchildren. There would be difficult days and uncertain moments, because life is never perfect regardless of love. But they would face everything together. Two people who'd found each other when neither was looking, who'd built something real and lasting despite the odds, who proved that love doesn't check your birth certificate before taking root in your heart. Margaret had once believed she was too old for second chances, too set in her ways for grand romance. Alexander had shown her otherwise, not through grand gestures, but through consistent presence, genuine partnership, and unwavering commitment. Their story wasn't conventional, and it didn't follow society's script for what love should look like. But it was theirs, authentic and hard-won, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Age was just a number. Love was timeless.